And I gotta say, Brian, it's really cool. In the last week, I've interviewed three folks that have served in the military, and actually, we're going live with an episode tomorrow morning. A sniper turned inner school teacher turned learning and development practitioner. So, yeah, where I'd like to begin our conversation is I just want to talk about your experiences in the Army. By the way, thank you for your service, Brian. And if you could, for our listeners, just share a little bit of your focus on operations and training.
Yeah, so I started in the Army right out of college, and as a brand new platoon leader, responsible for about 40 folks or so, and including some sub leaders. And regardless of the mission, one of the primary responsibilities of a leader in the military is to make sure that their folks are trained to do their job. In fact, especially outside of wartime operations, that's pretty much all you do, is train and prepare. And I think that set a really interesting foundation for me career-wise into L&D after almost 15 years or so of operating as a salesperson, to kind of come back to that foundation of ultimately training and development. And it's interesting too, if you look at least my experience as an Army officer, if you look at the structure of different levels of military command, and there are staffs that support that organization and that commander. There's a staff officer called an S3, and their role specifically is training and operations. And it's not lost on me that those two are really connected. It isn't training, and operations is somebody else. And those roles, while they may look a little bit different from command to command and level to level, are almost in many ways the right hand of the commander. They have an executive officer, but it really is that training and operations officer that is at the table at every single meeting, really helping ensure that the organization is prepared to do its mission. And so that sort of got instilled in me, I think, early on, and pops out every now and then in my civilian incarnation of being a training guy.
I can imagine, and it's going to inform our conversation today. But where I'd like to begin, Brian, and you and I kind of had a pre-chat about this, is the current state of L&D and reflect on it. And, I'd like to just give a quick disclaimer. By no means are we, critical of the people that are in this field. There's such amazing practitioners dedicating careers, often starting from their education. And they're doing amazing work with what they've got. But we on this podcast, we simply dare to dream, and I shouldn't say simply, we dare to dream, we want to be courageous, and in that process we want to challenge everything in order for us to look for better ways. And over the last 6 years that I've been in this industry, I've met hundreds of folks, and often it feels like there's endless complexity. We're raising questions of the human condition, the human mind, the motivations. Feels like we could talk about it forever. So, Brian, if you could, give me your current state of the world of L&D.
My current state of the world of L&D. I'm going to have to fall back on my own experiences, as much as I try to inform myself and read about, what's going on and interact with others. As I think about L&D and what the most effective training organizations are doing within businesses, not unlike that military example we opened our conversation with. They are deeply, deeply tied to the business. And I think however one is able to achieve that in learning and development is going to drive a level of value and effectiveness that is unparalleled. I think any time there is some degree of separation, and I'll share what I mean here in a second, between learning and development and the business. That distance, is, in my opinion, bad news. And so, a couple of observations that just illustrate that a little bit. One is, it's not uncommon to find learning and development organizations paired with the HR function in organizations, and appropriately, there are businesses out there that have L&D as a separate function, and I've been in teams that have been both ways. And one of the things that I find, given that dare to dream challenge that you issued out there, is the organizations where L&D is a separate function seem, in my opinion, to be more effective. I think it's obvious, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with talent. It may make sense to combine human resources, which is all about people, with learning and development. But I think that creates potentially an additional layer of separation between the training function and the business, which creates additional distance between the organization and the end users of it. Sometimes HR, has a brand issue. Whether it's considered a necessary evil, or yes, we have to have HR from a compliance perspective, or when we need to hire or fire people. Sometimes in organizations that I've been a part of, HR is viewed perhaps as a little bit fluffy. That's where you talk about emotional intelligence and wellness, and again, all important topics, 100%. But sometimes that impacts the brand, excuse me, and the effectiveness of an L&D function. And so, where I've been a part of organizations where the L&D leader, that L&D team is part of the business, in fact, reports specifically into the business leader, those are the most effective that I've seen and have had experience with.
And maybe that is a place for us to go, putting ourselves in the mind of the operations leader.
Yeah.
Whether they're responsible for safety, revenue, patient outcomes, it doesn't matter what the performance goal is. They're not typically looking to learn more about amygdalas.
Yeah.
Asymmetric learning, kind of, Brian, I know I took some of the words from our discussion.
Yeah.
They're not looking to sit through multiple hours of neuroscience. And again, the human condition and its complexity is so deep that we could put them through PhD programs.
Yeah. And there are, right? I think, Adam, that's an excellent point. I like to describe myself first and foremost as a business person. I am deeply interested in what the KPIs and metrics are that my business leader is interested in. I want to know, and I encourage my team to understand, what are the challenges and opportunities? What keeps those business leaders up at night? What are they being asked to produce? Again, whether that's in an operational, environment, in a sales environment, it just so happens that I look at the world through the lens of a learning and development professional, not unlike a marketing lead. We'll look at the exact same set of KPIs through a marketing lens, and an operations lead may look at that exact same set of KPIs through a process, systems, efficiency, effectiveness kind of lens. And I think sometimes in the L&D world, people tend to take themselves a little seriously. Maybe that's going to be different for every individual. So I realize I'm generalizing a lot, but I love the examples that you shared from our earlier conversation. At the end of the day, business leaders need results. They need to demonstrate top line, bottom line, etc. And how we get there, they're pulling us in as, learning and development professionals to get them there, but they don't necessarily need an entire diatribe about, fancy, neurology and brain pathways and, fancy terminology, federated, synchronous versus asynchronous, modalities. All of that stuff makes us sound pretty special. But at the end of the day, it's almost like you're talking a different language. And so, for the listeners out there, I would be very, very cautious about what's the goal you're trying to drive ultimately at the end of the day. And I think, for any function like L&D, the goal is to drive value and to demonstrate that value. And anything that creates some challenges there is risky. I think, and I think that's part of the challenge with organizations, especially larger ones that have centralized L&D functions. I think that's part of the challenge with organizations that may have L&D, kind of hidden within, this rubric of human resources or people, because it seems a lot less tangible, a lot more distant and more ephemeral. And at the end of the day, if we're not ringing the cash register and we can't demonstrate our value, then the cold hard truth is we're vulnerable, we're overhead. And so I know there's a lot of work, a lot of blogs and articles out there around how you measure the effectiveness of learning and development and all of the different variables that go into it. But I think as a starting point, it's really got to be about driving a business metric. It's got to be that black and white. There have been times when I've joined learning and development teams and I've looked at the performance objectives. Just to give you another example, Adam, of the L&D team itself, and they're primarily initiative based. Again, in my experience, maybe activity based. Learning team is going to deliver X number of these sessions or support XYZ project or initiative, and being able to articulate what the business outcome of that is, and being able to measure that, and being able to say and demonstrate that learning and development had a role in driving towards X, business goal, I think is really, really powerful. So I had a mentor once upon a time that said, don't confuse activity with value. And I have it right over there, actually, on my whiteboard, just in red letters, just to kind of keep me grounded that at the end of the day, we're business people trying to drive a result.
It's almost like we're standing, looking to build a bridge between two worlds. The worlds are initiatives and activities versus value, business partner versus business person. In order to do that, we have to ask and be ready for the response of the question of what are you trying to accomplish on the operational side. All right, because that many L&D leaders, they don't want to ask. Because once you ask and you open up that conversation, you're stepping into that level of responsibility. And let's be honest, on the operational side, the pressures are high. You have very specific metrics to hit. There's a lot of volatility, uncertainty. There are there's just so much going on. So Brian, let's go there. Let's talk about not a centralized L&D as part of HR, but back to the military experiences. Having L&D as the right hand of the operations, being inside the unit. What does that world look like, and how do we think about the initiatives, people initiatives, that contextualize business goals? I know that's a big question to ask. Let's start to unpack it layer by layer.
Yeah, I love it. I could chat about this kind of stuff all day with you because it's fun, right? And I think the goal that you articulated, I think should be a goal of a learning and development organization at whatever level, whether that's a corporate or certainly something smaller. I think the model can be the same, which is a learning and development team that is integrated into the function, has a high degree of subject matter expertise, which doesn't necessarily mean that the L&D team needs to have come or sprouted organically from the organization, though certainly there are benefits to that. And really being so close to the business that you understand what the strategies are, what the tactics are, and what the black and white objective goals are for the organization. So I'll tell another anecdote just to illustrate that. So as I've come into various L&D organizations and I've seen performance goals, right, that were primarily activity based, one of the first things that I do is I will tweak the performance goals to mirror the goals of the business line. So for example, if I'm supporting a sales organization, the sales leaders will have goals around top line revenue, expense management, customer client engagement, right, in some way, shape, or form. I will take those exact identical metrics, and put them in the L&D team. And listen, it's a change management conversation. I'm not going to suggest that this kind of change happens overnight, but what we're really talking about, Adam, is something that's cultural. And in every instance that I've done that, I get all sorts of questions or pushback. Well, how can I be responsible for sales? I don't have a sales goal. I'm not on the phone or out on the street or online, engaging with prospects. And my answer is, you're absolutely right. You're not. But there are things that you can do, and I kind of flip the conversation. Like, what can you do to make a positive influence? What if your compensation L&D person was variable, not unlike a salesperson? How would you organize your day differently, your week, your month? If you're an L&D leader and your compensation was totally 100% variable, tied to the performance of the business, what would you do differently with your team? And I'm not suggesting that L&D teams go to like some sort of like variable comp model. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it's a really great conversation starter. And not only does it have the benefit of making sure that those L&D teams are lined in on what is most important and are fluent in that, it's an amazing talking point to share back with the business. Hey, Chief Sales Officer, I want you to know that one of the things that I've done in my first 90 days is I've realigned the performance goals of my team to this. And it is a very powerful way to demonstrate that we're not just in the boat with you, but we're picking up an oar, and we're rowing and we're breaking a sweat because we have as vested an interest in the organization hitting those goals as somebody whose compensation, for example, is directly tied to that. So, I think it gets back to this level of closeness, of proximity to the business, of being able to relate, to embed the same culture, to have the same kind of goals. It's just that we tackle them a little bit differently, or maybe a lot differently, but the goal is the same goal. And that's very similar, in the military. Everybody's got the same goal. at the end of the day. It's what the logistician does versus the infantry person versus the artillery person, like that all needs to kind of get ironed out and coordinated, but the goal isn't different. And I think there's a lot of clarity in that type of structure and culture that can lend itself to a civilian corporate L&D environment.
I can only imagine how drastically different that conversation is. Hey, Chief Revenue Officer, we are going to accomplish 5 workshops next year, and we're going to send out 1,000 emails, versus we understand we need to improve revenue by 10% as a business and hit a $100 million revenue goal. That's an entirely different alignment structure. Brian, and I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of the tactics of the Future People initiatives, but before we do, I always chat about the current mindset, the attention span, stress, anxiety, uncertainty, economical, political, social. How do you see the current mindset that we should, perhaps must contextualize before we think about creating any kind of change?
So to ask a clarifying question back, are you talking about like the cultural mindset in the learners that we support, or in the learning and development team, or even, all of the above more widely?
Good question, Brian. I'm just thinking about the current mindset of all, I don't like the word employees, but all of the people in the workplace. Yes, I think learners would be the foundational, because whatever we're looking to activate and sustain, let's think about how we get through. I call it, talk about it as the noise. How do we reach them?
Yeah, and it's changing. There's a lot of material and content, and most of it very good. Some of it navel gazing, but around the different generations and what employees need. And that's taken slightly different turns given COVID and the pandemic and whatnot. I think if I were to really reduce it down to something, very tangible, very foundational, I think not unlike the business, since we were on that theme, you have to be able to demonstrate value to the employee. Otherwise, you're not going to get them to show up, or you're going to get them to show up and be completely unengaged, and it's just a waste of everybody's time. That employees, the businesses, the learning and development teams, which are extremely resource strapped and doing amazing stuff with very, very little. I'll give an example. An organization that I was a part of a few years ago really used on-demand e-learning as a way to drive training out to the field, out to these branches. And they were very boring. They were very dry. They kind of followed a format that was a template that perhaps 10 years old, and nobody had really kind of engaged in any sort of innovation. And not surprisingly, what the staff did is they went, click next, went, click next, went, click next, guessed at a little bit of a 3 to 5 question knowledge check, and then we're done, checked that box, and went on break, and didn't retain anything. And so, I think one of the cool things I think about L&D as well is, how do you demonstrate the value of your deliverable to the field? There's a little bit of marketing in there. There's, you're pulling on understanding why your learning is going to be important to them, what the benefit is. All of these things that we take for granted and as table stakes. And then for some reason, in the communication and marketing of these training events, in the way they are put together, we kind of forget about all of that and just hit rewind and play again, and rewind and play again. And we're putting the same, oftentimes the same stuff, the same crap, out, month over month, year over year. And so I think that's a balancing act with, resources that folks have, and this other persona that sometimes we see in learning and development as a L&D practitioner, as an artist. And they've gone to school, they have these certifications, they have the fancy vocabulary, and they'll work real hard putting together a Lamborghini, when a Corolla will work just fine. There's this idea too of kind of exploring this MVP, this minimum viable learning product that can get to the field as effectively and quickly as possible, and then you iterate, and that you iterate on it. I think an observation that I'm seeing more recently is this strong need for community. In my current organization, we have an early talent program. We bring people in to the industry right out of college, we've been doing pulse checks and feedback surveys, and that is a theme that is coming through loud and clear. How do we drive community? There's all sorts of ways to do that with technology, and it could be something as easy as leveraging Teams or some other kind of platform where you're creating a social environment for folks to certainly engage with each other at a similar point in time in their careers in the same kind of role. But you can tweak these things just a little bit and turn them into learning as well, reflection, sharing, etc. So I think that is a theme that probably has always been there in some way, shape, or form, but I'm really seeing the volume turned up on it now.
I wanted a couple minutes ago, something you said really got me thinking. There was a podcast last week, and one of the guests said, "Hey, we assume they're a captive audience. They're not. We must sell them on the value of the experience." And you also said, from kind of started to mention marketing and how do we think about what we do on the marketing side in order for us to whether sell, increase awareness, talk about the brand. There's all these aspects. So Brian, if you could maybe double click a little bit, what could we take from the world of marketing as we think about the future of people initiatives? How do we make them more effective with what we can learn from marketing?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Certainly an emphasis, let me rephrase that. Not an emphasis so much, but a recognition that metrics matter. I think is critical to L&D, and not something that, at least in my experience, I've seen consistently. And it's there are learning management systems out there, learning experience platforms. There's all sorts of ways to gather data. I really recommend L&D do that, and do it intentionally, but do it thoughtfully as well. Again, some great advice I got once upon a time is measure it, but what are you going to do with it? You can measure all sorts of stuff, and then it just becomes white noise, right? So measure with intentionality. And then I think the other thing is to really, really know your audience, and to then build learning and development deliverables that align to the audience. I mean, there's always some sort of technical skill that is going to need to be done. There's some sort of compliance training, but deeply understanding what makes them tick, what's important to them, and working that into the communications and the learning itself, I think is going to be really powerful, because at the end of the day, you're fighting for a limited amount of time, limited amount of mental space that people have. We got to go beyond that sort of very tired adult learning trope of Well, you have to tell them the why, not just the what. Again, I think a lot of that stuff, Adam, that's table stakes now. How do you go above and beyond that to really capture that attention space and to keep people engaged? And so I think, the content is a part of it, but I think how, there's this notion of the what and the how. I think the how is equally important. And you see industries that are doing like amazing, exciting stuff out there, and you see industries that, gosh, it particularly in my experience in the financial services, where it looks like it's boring. And I wouldn't want to spend 30 minutes or 45 minutes sitting in something like that, or listening to a subject matter expert like drone on, even if it was valuable. There's got to be some, I don't know if I can say this right, but some sex appeal, if you will. When you think about what makes effective marketing, the strong marketing organizations not only understand their audience, but are amazingly creative and innovative. And I think L&D can find that balance point between effective use of resources, which I get are limited, and really appealing to their learner audience. Otherwise, and it becomes a bit of a flywheel if you do that effectively too, right? Sorry.
No, I'm saying there's the courage. You're opening up the conversation, I think, to the level where we must go. So let's talk about the discretionary effort, right? So we responded to the critical email, we responded to our manager. We're taking a moment, a pause, right, between those critical tasks. We open up our phone, and what's waiting for us, right? Algorithms that have spent gazillions, not an official term, like trillions in order to get our attention. They understand us, sex appeal, the images, the products, the headlines, and almost no need for cognitive activation. We're just looking at the information, and it's being absorbed almost without any effort by us. And then we need to compete with that. We need to compete for that discretionary effort. That is a monster challenge. We need to change the way we think. We need to change the way we understand. You said to know your audience. That's our audience. They're opening up Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. You name a platform, whether they're admitting it or not. That is the new I'm taking a break mode.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It's and there are such cultural headwinds to that within learning and development. I have a number of kids at home, and you know what they're doing? TikTok. I'm not a big TikTok person, but and there are algorithms and artificial intelligence that will drive the type of content that is put in front of them. I mean, so there's that aspect, and I know AI in the context of learning and development is a very hot topic. But even just the format itself, someone on a phone, going like this, with their finger, learning, and they don't even realize they're learning kinds of things. People talk about micro learning. Oh, we're gonna look at what we've done. We've taken this, what had been an hour-long virtual instructed-led webinar, and we've broken it into 10-minute, chunks. That's like 10 years ago. Everybody's like running around patting themselves on the back about, micro learning, and, your learners are looking at stuff not in like 5 to 10 minute blocks. They're looking at it in like 15-second blocks. So how do you compete with that, right? How do you build learning and development that addresses to that new milieu? I think is a really, really important question. I don't necessarily have all the answers to, right? But I think that's an observation, and can be really exciting for the right people.
And on this podcast, we don't, the way I explain, why are the titles questions?
Yeah.
We don't have answers. Let's just start with finding the right questions to ask. What you just asked as the question kind of blew my mind there for a second. You're basically saying that micro-learning is how do we position the 10 to 15 second blocks, because on the personal side, I mean, look, like for years, I never touched TikTok, Instagram, none of these platforms. Then I got into pickleball and I started kind of searching a few things on Instagram. And all of a sudden now I find myself, I have a few minutes to relax. I'll go on Instagram and off it goes. Like 10, 15 seconds, I see a move, there's a lesson. And hey, click here for a YouTube video that's 10 minutes. Nah, it's a little long. I don't have that kind of commitment. But I'll spend 10 minutes looking at how many 10 to 15 second blocks? It's lazy. It's lazy, but that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
We need to embrace it.
And I think there's a really interesting opportunity to, I'll get a little political on you, but to democratize, right? That's as political as I'll get on this podcast, but to democratize that learning, right? So, not unlike TikTok and Instagram, and this content isn't cultivated, it isn't built and managed by like this large content organization within Instagram, right? It's all the users are doing it. And again, I'm also not quite sure fully what that may look like in a learning and development world, but I know that also is a conversation within that function that is being had. Like, how do you take what is in people's heads already, experienced folks, people who have the black and blue marks, and give them the means to quickly and easily, as subject matter experts, develop their own content and put it out there. Right? I love it as an L&D guy because it doesn't take any real resources for me to commit to, from my team, to do it right. It's authentic. Right? Nobody wants something that's highly polished, highly produced. But then on the other hand, how do you screen out the junk? Also, that gets, I guess, put out there. That I also think is a very interesting question that I don't necessarily have all the answers to. But I think, like, in all of the L&D organizations that I've been a part of, the ratio, right, between how large the L&D team is and the organization that it is supporting, it is like the change is significant. I mean, we have very limited resources. We're not going to get more. So how do you drive breadth and depth of learning with something that is relatively finite, right? And I think some of these platforms like a TikTok, that will allow us to tap into this larger organizational knowledge and history, I think is really, really compelling and exciting.
Yeah. So you mentioned something there, and I want to just point out that I want to continue to stress test this on the podcast, because my theory is that if learning and development begins to talk about metrics that are operation facing and can begin to show how behaviors and performance are linked, I think the question of resources would open up. I think it's a paradigm shift in what the L&D budgets are and what the resources are. But that's a whole other podcast. I just wanted to go on note that, hey, I think that's an interesting topic there. So Brian, our audiences, as you know, are champions, kind of similar to yourself, who are fighting the good fight. They believe this matters. They're looking to get alignment typically on how to move the organization to think about learning and development or change management, how to think about people initiatives in a different way. And they're looking for advice. And alignment, internal alignment, is some of the biggest challenges to begin with. What advice would you give for our champions that are listening in, how to continue their journey in order to elevate how they create people initiatives?
I guess my most basic piece of advice would be do something. Just start. You don't have to have all of the answers. You don't have to have, all of these white papers and stuff like that. We have eyes, we have ears, look at what's going on around you and try something. And I say that knowing that every organization is different and every culture is different and has different degree of latitude to, try. But I think look for ways to drive value to the business. Whatever that means and however you can do it. If it's not within, your organization's desire or your control to change functional organizational matrices and org charts, then okay, don't punt. What else can you do as an L&D person to build your brand, to build the brand of your team, and to drive the kind of value that you want? Simply changing the organization without that other aspect or aspects also is, just half the battle. So I think, have a bias for action would be one. I think control what you can control would be another. And I think as you build credibility and make those deposits, be innovative, have fun, try stuff, and don't be afraid to fail. If you fail fast, and kick that idea to the curb and move on to the next one, and really push that culture down to the very frontline staff of L&D teams, who typically are going to have much better insights and ideas and thoughts, may even be primarily subject matter experts that came from, the audience of learners that they are now accountable for, and as L&D leads, be that safety net for them to try new things. I think as long as it's not unethical, immoral, or illegal, go for it. And I think there's this entrepreneurial spirit, right? That we can own our functions, and we, not unlike other functions and other very successful business people. I think it's, the characteristics are the characteristics, of success, bias for action. Those are the behaviors, measure, iterate, don't wait for some 100% solution, when the, something less than that is ready and available now, and, demonstrate constantly, be cognizant of the fact that, there is a understandable distance between the business and, L&D as a function. How do you constantly champion what you're doing in a way that matters to your business partner? I think that was a little rambly, Adam, but I think that's what I would sort of reduce it to.
I think it was inspiring, Brian. You're really giving folks something to think about, and this idea that you got to drive value to the business. You started with that. You brought that from your military experiences. We talked about it throughout. And here, kind of to wrap it up, is really, that is your main advice. I know you've shared a lot more, but go and add value to the business. Brian, this was incredible. I look forward to our continued conversations. I just appreciate you jumping on and sharing what you've shared with our audience. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. We got to get a part two, a part two going.
I'm into that. Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Over and out.